Well, according to the media, EU Parliament just had their elections, and apparently we're all diving into fascism. That's right. According to them, a bunch of right-wing, ultra-right-wing, ultra-far right-wing nationalist candidates won seats in the EU Parliament, kind of shifting the whole dynamic out there. And this was something that apparently they didn't expect, but they're going to make sure to let all of us know that it is potentially the end of the world, unless, of course, we put people that the mainstream media likes back in power. And this has implications, not just for Europe, it has implications for the United States, because a lot of the issues that cause people to win seats in the EU Parliament are also issues which are affecting the presidential election here in the United States. And so we're going to ask the question, is this going to bring about any change in the EU? Is it as bad as the mainstream media says it is, or are there some positives here, right? Does the mainstream media actually have some points about some of the political parties that won, or is it a lot of hyperbolic nonsense? Again, we're going to discuss all of that. Plus, we're also going to take a look at the fact that when you look at polls going on in the United States right now, Trump is up by 18 points in swing states. That's nuts. Does what's going on in Europe have any impact on what's going on in the United States? All of that and more coming up on this episode, brought to you by Good Ranchers. Now, I want to encourage everyone to go into our community chat. You'll find the link right there on the show notes page. Go over into the circle. Let us know what you think of this episode and help us decide what future episodes should look like. As always, I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines.
Hello.
And then not in the studio, but helping us out today is, of course, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking. So before we get into this whole discussion and why it really is important to the United States and why I think in some ways it could be a bellwether, not just for individual parliamentary elections, which are going to be taking place in Europe, some of them unexpectedly, but also what's going on here in the United States, because a lot of the issues are similar. Very similar. When we talk about energy policy, when we talk about immigration, when we talk about crime, it turns out Europe is dealing with a lot of the same issues the United States. And again, is this a bellwether? And that's the thing that people really want to know. And the other thing that you really should know is that Independence Day is coming up in the United States, in these United States. And I always call it Independence Day. I don't know why I don't like calling it the 4th of July, because I want people to remember what it is that we're celebrating. We're celebrating the beauty of American independence. And guess who's going to help with that? Good Ranchers. That's right, because here in America, when we celebrate Independence Day, we do it with a lot of meat. And that's what Good Ranchers is providing. In fact, if you go on right now and you order one of their subscriptions, let me tell you some of what you're getting. Because on those subscriptions, they're willing to give you up to $100 off. Plus, they've got a whole round of other deals. Like, for instance, you get 2 packs of All-American smoked bratwursts in every order for a year at no additional cost, right? But you got to go over to goodranchers.com. You got to put in promo code Nick, and you got to get this like now, right? Sign up for this now, because you don't want to be there on Independence Day at the barbecue with nothing in hand. Is that really what you want to be? Is that America? Is that what our founders would have wanted? The answer is no. So goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, sign up for one of those subscriptions, get up to $100 off, and get brats with your orders. Free of charge. They're just doing it for you, right? They're just doing it for you. All right. So once again, thank you very much to Good Ranchers for sponsoring this. Let's go ahead and jump into the episode. So first things first, what does the EU Parliament actually do? So to give everyone kind of an idea, the EU Parliament operates a little bit like a bicameral legislature. So if you look at the United States, we have the House of Representatives, we have the Senate, then we have the executive branch. Most European governments operate a little bit differently. You have a president, but the person that's really kind of running the legislative process and running the government is actually the prime minister, right? So again, the parliamentary democracy is a little bit different from the constitutional republic that we have. So in the EU Parliament, you have the parliament itself, and then you also have the EU Commission. And this kind of works like a bicameral legislature. It's not a perfect carbon copy of like the House and the Senate, but essentially, if the EU Parliament wants to look at a bill, they have to work in concert with the Commission. Then they can look at a piece of legislation, or they can request it. It'll come down from the Commission. They can make amendments. They can make suggestions. They can change things with respect to the budgetary items, but it has to go back to the EU Commission before it can actually go into effect. So the EU Parliament is a legislative body. They also have, I think it's up to like 20 commissions or committees where they do hearings and they do investigations and they come up with various policies or goals that they have. And then they also have that budgetary function as well. So those are kind of like the three main functions of the EU Parliament. All right, so it doesn't mean that anything EU Parliament does, every member state has to, automatically get on board for. Obviously, there's still a degree of state sovereignty, but they do have a great deal more kind of authority over member states than, say, the UN would have over its member states. And so the EU Parliament, it's not just a do-nothing body, right? They do have a budget. They do have lawmaking capabilities. And so it's important to understand that elections that take place in the EU do affect those member states. And because the European Union is a major trade zone, it affects the rest of the world as well. So that's kind of a very, very brief, synopsis of the EU Parliament. If you want to learn more, you can go to their website. We also found a pretty good YouTube video on this as well, where they do a very good job of just doing a quick overview. If you go to it's EU Made Simple on YouTube, you can go over there and they have a channel called What is the European Parliament? It's about a 3-minute explanation. And again, provides a pretty good overview, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. So we're now going to jump into what exactly happened with these election results. So let's go ahead and pull up this first link here. And again, for a lot of us, you're probably wondering what does this even mean, right? What is the EPP and the S&D and the ECR and all these other parties? So to give you an idea, the EPP is let me bring it up here real quick. The EPP is the European People's Party group, and this is kind of like the center-right coalition of conservative members or certain conservative members of the EU Parliament. And one of the things that's important to understand here is that a lot of these candidates get elected by the political parties they're affiliated with in their home country, right? So they'll get elected to EU Parliament as a member of their party, but then when they get to EU Parliament, they usually sit with one of these other groups, which is kind of like a consolidation of various parties, various members that have similar objectives or goals. So it's not exactly as if it's not like someone ran as the European People's Party candidate. They ran as a candidate within their home country with whatever party they affiliate with. Maybe it's liberal, maybe it's conservative, maybe it's green, whatever. And then when they get to European Parliament, that's who they sit with. That's essentially who they caucus with. Is that a pretty good explanation?
They're coalitions.
Yeah.
They're it's funny. They're coalitions within coalitions, right? Because you have individual elections within each member state. And then once somebody gets elected as a member of the European Parliament and they actually go to Brussels, then they can form these caucuses, basically. And the EPP historically has basically been kind of, I don't want to say governing party because that might imply a lot more than what I'm actually trying to get across. The word might be a bit too strong.
Yeah.
But the EPP historically has been one of the major forces of stability within the Parliament. Usually they form... Again, coalition is not the right term here because I don't want to get across that there's a single government like there is in, say, the UK or the US. But they'll form working agreements with other coalitions. And the funny thing is that historically the EPP, despite being listed or interpreted within mainstream sources as a center-right coalition, the EPP historically actually allies itself with the center and the center left. And when they say center left, we would mean the left.
Holy
because
crap. Yeah.
The S&D is usually the other block on the left that the EPP would work with in order to, again, have a governing coalition. And again, that's not the right term.
Well, but let's talk about this real quick, right? So the EPP currently holds 189 seats. So again, if you think of the EPP as kind of like, at best, a center-right party. But
they're the Mitt Romney Republicans.
But in reality, they're more center, right? They're more center. S&D EPP had 189 seats. They gained 13 seats. S&D is at 136 seats. They lost 3 seats. So what is the S&D? What is the center-left party? Oh, let me go ahead and look at it right here. It is the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, right? Like that's the center-left. Center left, not far left.
So just like our center left.
Not far left, right? Center left party, right? They lost 3 seats. The ECR They have 83 seats. They gained 14 seats. So the ECR is the European Conservatives and Reformists. And they're considered, right wing, and they have what they consider to be like center right and far right factions. And don't worry, we're going to get into this whole conversation about what constitutes a far right faction. But one of the things that it makes them different from the EPP is the EPP is pro-Europeanism. So if you think pro-EU versus skeptical of EU, the EPP is the center party that is pro-EU. The reason why
so like controlled opposition. Basically.
Yes, yeah. But when you look at the I'm bringing it up here again.
To give you an idea, Ursula von der Leyen is a member of the EPP.
Well, and we'll get into that later because most people are that's yeah. Anyway, the ECR gained 14 seats. All right, so they have 83 seats. They gained 14. That's a big jump. The ECR, on the other hand, identifies as what they call soft Euroscepticism. So it's not as if they're completely against the European Union, but they're a little bit more concerned about the growth of the EU. They still respect individual sovereignty.
They don't like a lot of the bureaucratic state that's been growing out of Brussels. Brussels has turned into almost this like multicultural, international capital. It's a globalist center basically, and soft Eurosceptics would say something like, depending on where they're coming from, they might either be like, I'm against the EU, or if you're a soft Eurosceptic, you're probably somebody that says, it's not that I'm against the EU or the concept of something like the Council of Europe, which was something that came out of the Second World War, but they would be very much against the idea of we're going to eradicate national sovereignty in favor of this union of states, and we're going to consolidate all the power in Brussels.
Yeah. So to give you an idea, like this is just kind of a description here of the Prague Declaration. So this is where the ECR sits. So free enterprise, freedom of the individual, more personal responsibility and greater democratic accountability, sustainable clean energy supply with an emphasis on energy security, the importance of the family as the bedrock of society, sovereign integrity of the nation state, opposition to EU federalism. So again, this whole concept of EU federalism, basically, if you look at the United States, right, we're a federated republic. So you have the federal government, but then you have individual states' sovereignty and governments. However, the federal government has a great deal more authority than the current EU government has over member states. And they oppose this idea of giving the EU even more authority over what they would consider to be traditional sovereignty. They believe in the overriding value of the transatlantic security relationship, so they're very big into NATO. Effectively controlled immigration and into abusive asylum procedures. This is interesting. So you would consider them to be more of a pro-immigration party, but they want it to be legal, and they have a problem with some of the asylum issues. Efficient and modern public services and sensitivity to the needs of both rural and urban communities, and into waste and excessive bureaucracy and a commitment to greater transparency, respect and equitable treatment for all EU countries, new and old, large and small. So if you were to read this off, this would kind of align a lot with what you would consider to be kind of like the Republican Party's, general platform in the United States.
At least what they claim to believe.
Yeah, at least what Republicans claim to believe. But again, this is something where a lot of people will tell you in the media, like, oh, the far right, right? And they include groups like this. Now, the one that has probably got the media the most flipped out. By the way, I want to point this out too. There's also a Renew Europe party. The Renew Europe party actually got slammed pretty hard. So they have 81 seats. They lost 21. Now, what I think is interesting about the Renew Europe party is that they are probably they strike me as being in some ways the most moderate of these center right.
They're the libs is what they really, what they are? They are the European equivalent of the Liberal Democrats. Yeah. And if you're a listener to this podcast and you live in the UK, you probably know what I'm talking about. The Lib Dems are kind of like a third party within Parliament that historically actually used to be the governing party. They used to be the chief opposition to the Tories 100 years ago, back when they were the Liberal Party. But then you had this other group called Labour that popped up and basically destroyed them from the left. So like Churchill actually used to be a liberal, and then he switched over to the Tories later on in life. And the liberals never recovered. And then in the 1980s, they merged with the Social Democrats, which were a breakaway, more moderate group within Labour. and they formed what's now called the Liberal Democrats, which exist today. But they're basically irrelevant, and they have been for a century. Now, they did briefly have a coalition government with David Cameron after the 2010 elections, and then they lost that coalition government in 2015. But the point is that you are a liberal Democrat if you are old, rich, and you pride yourself on, I'm an independent thinker and a centrist, and I don't like either major party. But what you're really doing, you're basically a neolib, is the best way to describe it. You are somebody that is very socially progressive, and you're totally fine with a giant, massive bureaucracy, but you'll say things like, oh, I'm not a socialist because I support, tax cuts for businesses, or I support corporate welfare or something like that. So you align yourself with the left 70% of the time, but you're not saying seize the means of production. You're saying things like subsidize the means of production.
You're probably, I would say you're like a Democrat from the 1980s, but it's not. You're more left-wing than that. You're maybe a Democrat from the early 2000s or something like that. But again, when you look at the way that they're categorized as center or center-right, and they're pro-Europeanism, right? So they're all about more power to the EU. They got crushed. They lost 21 seats. In fact, they lost more seats. They lost more seats than any other party. And what I think is interesting about this is, again, they're categorized as center-right. So, well, gosh, if the right wing was just winning elections all night, well, no, because European voters are like, no, we don't want someone pretending to be right wing. We don't want someone pretending to be center-right. This is a big fight we have in the United States right now, right? Where you've got these, what are the Lincoln coalition Republicans, where they can't find a Republican they like unless it's a Republican that's betraying other Republicans. Yeah. And it's always this idea of maintaining some sort of status quo, because let's face it, some people actually do really, really well when they're in the minority party, because they end up being the ones that negotiate things. They end up being the ones that get their bills passed, because they don't have any real opposition to what the left is doing. They're just like, well, this is a little crazy. I'll tell you who they are. They're the jackasses that the only thing they conserve is what the left did 10 years ago, right? Yeah. Whatever the left's doing right now, 10 years from now, these are the people like, well, we've got to conserve the status quo. They never fight against the absurdity that's actually happening in the moment. In fact, they really get a kick at showing up to like the liberal cocktail parties and be like, I'm not like those other conservatives. You're right, because you're not at all, right? You're just a whatever.
And to give you an idea, Renew Europe historically has been a partner of the EPP in forming, again, I'm going to keep saying governing coalition, even though I don't think that that's the appropriate term.
It's fine.
But point is that they've worked with the EPP in order to control a majority of the seats within the European Parliament historically. It's also worth noting that this is the first election that the European Parliament has held since Brexit.
Yeah.
So there's a whole batch of seats that just literally don't even exist anymore because they used to be allocated to the United Kingdom and they're not there anymore. And so that's really scrambled a lot of things, where when you look at the vote totals and the seat counts, it's almost as if every party lost seats because the parliament is physically smaller than it was 5 years ago, when they last held an election right before the UK exited the European Union. So it's just, when you look at the results, it's worth keeping that in mind, that the map has been entirely
So basically that
changed.
was the last time that the sky was falling for them, was when Brexit happened. And you remember how hysterical everyone was when that happened.
Well, in 2019, in fact, actually, let me pull up the Wikipedia article for it, because believe it or not, the people on Twitter that edit these things actually know what they're doing. Yeah. When you look at the 2019 results, you see that the Greens actually made huge gains in 2019. And so what happened is that 2019 in some ways was actually a victory for the left in the last European parliamentary election. And look at what's happened in the country since then. Yeah. So Nick was talking about how in this segment of the podcast, we wanted to talk about what happened. I mean, you brought up earlier that the Greens ended up getting demolished.
Yeah, to give you an idea, the Greens lost the second largest amount of seats. They lost 20 seats. So they're at 51 seats, so they lost 20. The Greens were also the ones that were blamed significantly for the energy policy that Europe has adopted, which one of the things that's so funny about this is when Trump spoke before I think it was before the United Nations. It might have been, I think it was
the UN.
And he was talking about how Germany is far too dependent, and Europe, by proxy, is far too dependent upon Russia for its energy needs. And the media all panned over to the German delegation that was just sitting there like sitting there mocking him, laughing.
Smug.
He doesn't know what he's talking about. And then all of a sudden, Russia, pipelines stopped flowing natural gas into Europe, and Germany was facing real energy problems because not only did they pretty much take their entire energy policy from a really angry 16-year-old Swedish girl, but then they also were like, whereas France at the very least said, hey, we're going to go heavy nuclear. Germany wasn't doing that as much. Germany had problems. They're like, no.
I wouldn't say as much. They were literally shutting down their nuclear
They were
plants.
shutting down nuclear. It's like, we will do it also the sun. Right?
Do you know the scandal
work.
that's currently there's a scandal that's been going on for a couple months now in Germany where the Greens, who are in government in Germany, there's something called the traffic light coalition in Germany where you have the SPD, which are the socialists, you have the Greens, so there's the red, you have the Greens, and committed absolute suicide, the Libertarians, the Free Democrats, which are the classical liberal, pro-free market, but socially progressive party, are the yellow part of the stoplight coalition. They're the three ruling parties in Germany right now. Well, there was this scandal that came out relatively recently where it found out that the Greens lied to the general public and altered government documents and reports that made it look like that the existing nuclear facilities in Germany were unsafe to continue operating and that they needed to be shut down. And then it came out that actually they were perfectly safe. You could have continued running them. And the Green Party lied to the public about it, which is part of the reason why opinion polling in Germany right now shows that the Greens and the Free Democrats and the SPD for that matter are all heading for just like they're heading for Tory style losses. Basically.
They're gonna get crushed. They're gonna get crushed. I mean, again, when energy prices are going up that high, you're gonna get crushed, and you deserve to because you also got caught lying. So the Greens lost 20 seats, right? Now the party the group that they are probably the most concerned about, who have 58 seats, they gained 9 seats. So to give you an idea, this party was well behind the Greens with respect to their representation in EU, the EU Parliament, and they flipped it, man. They went up. So now, whereas the Greens only have 51 seats because they lost 20, the Identity and Democracy Party is at 58 seats. They gained 9. So now, when you hear when I first heard Identity and Democracy, I was like, what are we talking about here? And this is also something I think it needs to be expressed. There is a very different conservative and liberal tradition in Europe that doesn't translate over to the United States as easily as you might think. A lot of times conservative parties in Europe started off as parties that were, very, very skeptical of what you might call liberal democracy, or they were monarchists. Now, that didn't mean they were all absolute monarchists. Obviously, the Tories in the UK put a great deal of value with respect to the institution of the monarchy, but still wanted representation in Parliament and all of those other things.
They were what we would call right-wing anti-liberal. And when I say right-wing anti-liberal, you say the word right-wing anti-liberal and everybody immediately thinks fascist, which is, I think, where Nick is going here with the designation. But that's actually not true. Right-wing anti-liberalism is a tradition that goes back to really the French Revolution. It long predates fascism. In fact, most right-wing anti-liberals would actually criticize fascism from the right and say that it's not steeped in tradition. It was not steeped in this sort of religion and culture and history that embodies a lot of what we would label the identity part of identity and democracy.
Yeah.
Identitarianism is this idea that Germany should be for the Germans and France should be for the French and Spain should be for the Spanish, and that there's a connection to the culture and the history and the language and the traditions within each of those countries. And this is why it doesn't necessarily translate very well into the United States. Continental philosophy and continental conservatism and traditionalism doesn't really, you can't extrapolate it over to the United States because in many respects, the United States was birthed by the Enlightenment and it was birthed by liberal traditions. And so the United States comes out of a not right-wing anti-liberal philosophy. No. It comes out of a liberal philosophy.
Yeah, it comes out of a classically, again, what we would call classical liberalism, which was the idea of, again, self-determination, individual liberty, private property rights. It's important to remember at various times the conservative parties in Europe were the ones that were fighting against the idea of individual liberty, suffrage, property rights. I mean, they believed in property rights, but they also believed that there was a tier toward it based off of things associated with the hereditary title, right, and nobility, and so the American tradition kind of is rooted in that classical liberal philosophy. So when we say conservative, that's what it's focused on. That's why you don't have any party in the United States, you don't have any right-wing party in the United States of any prominence advocating for monarchy, right? You don't have anyone advocating shut up. You don't have anyone advocating for monarchy. You don't have anyone advocating for titles of nobility or whatnot. It's pretty much universally opposed within the United States. The real distinction is more between what you would call leftist ideology and classical liberal ideology. Now,
it's worth noting that identity and democracy are not all like monarchists.
No. Well, that's the thing I want to get to, right? Is that there's a different tradition within Europe, and part of the problem too is that there's a lot of people that talk about how World War II kind of broke Europe,
and it did.
World War II kind of broke Europe in the sense that, obviously, fascism and Nazism were just so incredibly horrific that any sort of association with those two things became absolutely just, again, horrendous, and as it should be, right? As it should be. The problem is that it also got passed off as this is clearly a right-wing phenomenon. But I don't think that's fair either, because when you actually look at the Italian Manifesto and when you look at the Nazi Manifesto, which was the National Socialist Workers' Party, what you actually find is a great deal in common with Marxism, a great deal in common with socialism. They were actually competing over the same voters. They were competing over the same constituencies. The difference largely between fascism and communism, or socialism in general, is that communism and socialism was very much rooted in Marx and the idea of the international proletariat, right? It was the idea that workers of the world unite, right? Mm-hmm. That was the thing. Whereas, Mussolini was an Italian socialist, but he wanted to be Italian, right? He took pride in being Italian and the nation of Italy and the history of Italy and all of that. And he wanted the greatness of Italy. And so a lot of your fascists adopted policies and principles which were very, very close to, central planning and socialism. The difference is that they would allow some private ownership of industry, but it had to work in accordance with what the state wanted it to do. You see Hitler talking about this, where he says, oh yeah, we're going to nationalize all the major industry, and we'll allow for some enterprise, provided it is meeting the goals of the Volk, right? Which he got to decide what that was. So there was a lot of similarities, but the problem is that in people's minds, it was, if you're far right, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi. If you're a nationalist, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi, because nationalism were characteristics of fascism and Nazism.
If you're a right-wing anti-liberal, you must be a fascist and a Nazi. It destroyed the traditional balance.
Because there used to be a lot of people in Europe that had nothing in common with fascists, certainly nothing in common with Nazis, but they were still nationalists. They still believed in the glory of France, the glory of Britain,
and they were still traditionalists as well. Yeah. They viewed. I've talked about this in a lot of these movements that, unfortunately, today it gets back into the whole World War II broke Europe. It broke the understanding of the political spectrum in Europe that had previously existed long before World War II, because now anything to the right, what happened is that by the time you get to today, if you're to the right of Obama, you're a fascist.
You're a far right wing. Well, and we're gonna get to that a little bit later when we talk about the left wing analysis of the right wing, because this is one of the things that I think explains what we're about to discuss in detail, and that is, why didn't the left see this coming, and what is their response to it, and why does their response to it actually mean that there's probably more of it coming? Because again, if you're not willing to say, and it's interesting too, because the Soviets, the communists, kind of got away scot-free from all of this. They talk all the day long about we got to be terrified of the far right threat. you lived in absolute fear of a nuclear holocaust in large part because of the far left threat, and yet you still have communist parties within France, within Germany, within other countries. And so it's important to understand that there's again, the reason why we say it broke Europe in many ways is because they became so laser focused on preventing fascism and Nazism, which is good. You should be focused on preventing those things. But they forgot about the extreme concept of communism and the authoritarianism that was realized within that. And the reason why I give this long explanation is because I want to now read off the ideology of the Identity and Democracy Party. And you tell me if you would consider this to be far right nationalist, like all the scary words that the press likes to use.
Mid-century Germans.
Yeah. Or do you, when you hear this, do you think, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? The group lists its core priorities as protecting European cultural heritage and the sovereignty of European nations, creating jobs and growth, increasing security, stopping illegal immigration, regulating legal immigration, fighting EU bureaucracy, and preventing what it describes as the potential Islamization of Europe. Identity and Democracy also opposes the possible ascension of Turkey to the European Union. The group calls for a Europe based on cooperation and further reforms of the EU through more transparency and accountability at Brussels, but rejects any further evolution towards a European superstate. That's when they're describing themselves, that's how they describe themselves.
That from my standpoint, I mean, if I was in Europe, if I was a member of the European Parliament, I probably would be caucusing with them based on what you've listed off. And none of what you listed off, at least to me, screams mid-century failed Austrian painter.
Yeah. Well, here's what, and then it immediately says, political commentators have variously described Identity and Democracy as nationalist, right-wing populist, anti-immigrant, Eurosceptic. Again, it's one of these things where the left got so used to being able to define everybody else on their terms and people would be scared by it. Well, oh my gosh, I don't want to be associated with anything far right because we know where that leads, right? But when you read off this ideology, like you read this versus the Italian Fascist Manifesto, or you read this versus the manifesto, it was like the 27 points of the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, right? The Nazis. They were very, very clear. Like the Nazis especially were very, very clear on their anti-Semitism, their just generalized racism against anyone that wasn't Aryan. The Italian Fascist Manifesto wasn't actually inherently racist from what I've read of it. It was very nationalist, but it wasn't necessarily racist. But again, we've all been taught, they're trying to program us to think that if you believe the things I just read off, that means right-wing nationalists. And what they really mean is, neo-Nazi. That's what they really mean. Neo-fascist, neo-Nazi.
They're trying to say that Identity and Democracy are the type of people that would have marched in Charlottesville in 2017.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's exactly what they're trying to say. And the reason why is because they've equated, and this has been a thing since 1945, they've equated nationalism with Nazism or nationalism with Italian fascism, which is absolutely absurd because nationalism predates both of those ideologies.
Yeah.
Nationalism goes back centuries. And again, we don't have a tradition of this in the United States because, and I think one's starting to form for different reasons. And that might be a different topic for another day. But in the United States, there's been this long tradition of this idea that America is founded by ideology just as much as it is by geography. Now, I think that's actually led to some problems because what that has done is that it's erased the idea that there can be an American identity.
Yeah.
And that has led to huge problems, especially within immigration here in the US. But in Europe, it's arguably even worse because you're not allowed to say, well, I have longing and feeling for my home country.
Yeah.
And I want to defend the culture and heritage that my family comes from.
Yeah.
Because if you say that, again, we're going to equate you with mid-century Germans.
Yeah, you're going to be a Nazi.
And for a lot of people, it's not, you can, believe it or not, you can live in Germany. I'll even use Germany as an example.
Yeah.
You can live in Germany today and you can say, I want to make sure that if somebody comes to my country that they want to learn my culture, be a part of my culture, learn my language, integrate themselves into society. I want them to become German, and I don't want me to have to embrace multiculturalism. And if you say that, you're now far right. You're a threat to democracy.
Well, think about how well this works into leftist ideology. Because if you are a socialist, right, if you are a Marxist, then of course you believe that the only thing that really matters is workers of the world unite, or the new paradigm might be oppressed of the world unite, right? So it's I guarantee you, AOC does not feel like she has more in common with her fellow Americans than she does with whoever she perceives to be oppressed in a foreign country. Like I saw this within the Virginia General Assembly where we were debating a gun bill, and one of the people said, well, look, the thing that we're trying to get rid of is actually a leftover from the Jim Crow era on forcing you to do X, Y, and Z. And this woman from the NAACP got furious. Like, how dare a white legislator tell me what about Jim Crow? And then a black Republican legislator, A.C. Cardozo, got up and said, oh, you need to hear it from a black face? Okay, great. I'm black. He's right. This is a leftover.
Let me guess. They weren't convinced still.
And another black legislator got up and just goes, well, this is the difference between skin folk and kin folk. Yeah, Delegate Munden King said that. Basically called Delegate Cardozo an Uncle Tom. That's basically what she did right there in the committee. Total violation of decorum, in my opinion. That's what she did. But for me, it was very informative because it was like, oh, it isn't about that, okay, he's black and he's sharing his experience. He doesn't have the right ideology for you. And so therefore he doesn't count anymore. That's what it comes down to.
It's not about,
it's the same concept, right? It's this idea that the ideology is what matters above all else. And if you share that ideology, if you share the oppressed status, or if you share the leftist status, well then great, you're worthy of consideration. And if you don't, you're my enemy.
Yeah, and this is something that the right, on both sides of the Atlantic, I think, are starting to realize, is that it's not about the best idea wins. For so long, we were convinced that we're in a battle of ideas, and as long as we make our case and we point to the facts and statistics and we assemble a good argument, we will win.
Yeah.
And, that's the way that democracy should work. That's absolutely the way that government should operate, is the best idea should win. But increasingly, we have found ourselves that, no, we are dealing with irrational actors, that it doesn't matter what type of argument you're making. The ideology matters. And if you don't share the ideology, you're a bad guy. And even if you're not a bad guy, we will paint you to be a bad guy.
Well, and here's how you know it's also a bait and switch, right? Because nationalist is a bad word now. Okay, great. So let's describe. If you like you said before, if you believe that, hey, I'm English, and I would like, if somebody comes to England, I would like for them to understand that you can bring your ideas and your thoughts with you. You can bring your culture with you, as long as you recognize that England was set up in a certain way. We have our own traditions. And while we're happy for you to express your concerns, you don't get to replace our traditions, right? You don't get to supersede. Our traditions don't have to make way for yours. We can include them in a nice and civil society, but they don't make way. And that is not what is going on. And so, again, most people around the world believe that, right? Except for the left in the West. And here's how you know. Show me one person on the left that would dare go into Saudi Arabia and say, you're not allowed to do it this way.
You're not being multicultural.
I am now here. I'm a leftist, and I'm now living in Saudi Arabia, and I now demand that you change the ways that your culture and society operates in order to accommodate me. Would they go into China right now and say, I demand that you change the way your society? No. What they will tell you is they have a right to their cultural heritage. They have a right. Great. Agreed. Are we the only ones that don't? Are we the only ones that don't have any right to say, hey, we also have a unique cultural heritage which manifests itself in certain ideas about political representation and processes, certain economic principles, certain concepts of property rights and individual liberty, as well as personal responsibility, that these are also core to our fabric and our culture, and we expect them to be respected. Nope. That's the only one you get to throw off, apparently.
Well, these are the same people that say that we don't have a culture.
Yeah.
Well, there's no culture in the United States. There's no culture. There's no culture to hearken back to. But what they mean by that is we've done our best to kill the culture in the United States, and therefore you're not allowed to reference it. We killed it. It's dead.
how many members of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament would be willing to go to Beijing and tell Xi Jinping that you're not being multicultural enough?
Yeah.
That China is not allowed to be for the Chinese.
Yes. Yeah. You don't get a place.
But again, it's this like,
well, do they tell
they would never say that, because they would say, oh, well, they're part of the global South. They're oppressed, right? You're not allowed to say this in Latin America. You're not allowed to say this in Central America. You're certainly not allowed to say this in Africa.
Well, here's a question.
Or the Middle East.
Would they say it to the Palestinians? Hey, Palestinians, you don't get this. Because after all, we're all supposed to be multicultural.
You need to tolerate the Jews.
Right? You need to tolerate that, right? Of course they would say that, because that would be a logical.
No, instead they would say free Palestine, Palestine for the Palestinians. And you know what? If you want to say Palestine for the Palestinians, but then you say that Germany for the Germans or France for the French is racist.
Yeah.
Then at that point, you've already told me everything that I need to know, because, and this is something that I've also brought up on the podcast, it is not enough to just point out the left's hypocrisies, because they're going to do it anyway. They don't care that they're being hypocrites. And if you want proof of this, look at how they've treated conservatives in Ireland, right? So when the French speak up about this, and France is one of the countries that had the biggest backlash against the left, Macron's party got annihilated, utterly destroyed in the European elections. And it was Marie Le Pen's National Rally that ended up winning most of the seats. They won a plurality of the seats in France within the European Parliament this year. And we're going to get to this later in the podcast. Le Pen might end up being Prime Minister of France pretty soon. But, you know, the argument that was made against the right in France when they say things like, well, we should assert our own national sovereignty because France belongs to the French. We're our own country. We're a sovereign nation. The argument is you're not allowed to do that because France engaged in colonialism. And the same thing in England. When people in the United Kingdom say things like, well, I'm concerned about the fact that we're importing over 1% of our entire population every single year. And it's even worse when they're not assimilating at all. And we're basically replacing the native population with foreigners that don't share our values, don't share our culture or customs, and don't want to. That's a problem. I don't want to be replaced by my own government. The response is, you're a racist for bringing that up because England engaged in colonialism. Yeah. But you know what's interesting? You know what also was colonized? Ireland was colonized. Yeah. Ireland did not engage in colonialism unless you want to argue that the millions of Irish that came over to America were the colonists, right? Yeah. That's the closest they ever got to colonialism, right? Ireland was colonized by the English. Go ask the average Irish person who understands his country's history what he thinks of Oliver Cromwell, and he'll give you a good example of colonialism. And you know what? When people in Ireland bring up the same exact concern, which is, wait a second, with all this talk about multiculturalism and the lack of a culture and how, again, we're just going to replace you with foreigners, that doesn't seem very fair to me because I've lived here forever and I should have a say in how my government operates. The idea is, well, you're not allowed to do that because you're racist.
Yeah.
But they can't point to any act of colonialism. And you know what's incredible is that the parties that engaged in open terrorism in order to get independence for Ireland, I'm thinking of you, Sinn Féin.
Yeah.
What were they saying 100 years ago? Ireland for the Irish, you know, foreigners out. Apparently they campaigned on Brits out and, you know, Afghanis in. Like, I mean, that's basically what Sinn Féin campaigned on. The reason why is because Sinn Féin are really communists at the end of the day.
Oh, yeah, they are.
Only leaned on nationalism when it suited their purposes in order for them to obtain political power. But the second that nationalism doesn't work for the left, because the left embraced nationalism before in European history.
Oh, yeah.
But the second that it doesn't suit their purposes, they will discard nationalism and equate it with, again, mid-century Germans.
Well, here's one of the things I think is interesting when we look at, so we've discussed what the right-wing parties are and what the far-right party is. Now let's discuss what the center and pro-democracy parties are, because this is how the left describes this stuff, right? So we have the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Now, if you want to go and look at on the Wikipedia pages for these respective political parties, if you want to go and look at the right ones, they will show you right up front, this is essentially what their ideology is. But then when you get into the left-wing parties, it's not quite as clear. I wonder why that is. You get the history of it. You get the presidents of the European Parliament. You get the organization. But then, like, I'm scrolling through here trying to find, like, okay, great. What are your policy positions? What's your positions on economics? What's your positions on? And it's difficult to find. But I'll tell you what. This is considered by, you know, all the people commentating on this. They're center left, right? Progressive Alliance. Let's look at the various presidents of the group. You have the French section of the Workers' International, the Belgian Socialist Society, the French section of the Workers' International, the Social Democratic Party, the Socialist Party. This is all from various countries, France, Germany, Belgium. The Socialist Party, the Labour Party of the UK, the Social Democratic Party from Germany, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party is the current leader of the organization. But again, if you're a self-described socialist, that's center left. That's center left. It's not even left, right? Because again, what is there? There's center left, there's left, and then there's far left. So an organization comprised of a bunch of people that call themselves the Workers' Party and the Socialist Party, which has always been associated with Marxism. Always been associated with Marxism. Nope, that's just center left. Pro-democracy. Pro-democracy. What about the Greens? Again, you go in here to the Greens wiki page. I'm looking for, okay, great. Where's the list of your ideology? Where's the list of your various, nope, can't find it. Can't find it. How about, this is one of my favorites, the left in the European Parliament. So this one actually gets left wing, right? So they actually get a designation of not center left, left wing. And it's European parties, Party of the European Left, Nordic Green Left Alliance, European Anti-Capitalist Left, Now the People, Animal Politics EU. Like these are all the various groups. And you look at it once again, who are the people that have actually led this group? The Communist Party, the left, like the actual leader, Francis Wirt in 1990 to 2009 was a part of the French Communist Party, right? These are the guys, is it far left? Far left, like actual communists leading this part. No, just left. Just left wing. They're just pro-democracy.
There is no such thing as far left. There is far right, but there's only just left. That's as far to the left as you can go. You can literally be a member of the French Communist Party, and you will be labeled by Wikipedia as being just left. Yeah. Just left.
Just want more social programs. You like healthcare for all, and gulags. But other than that, but I mean, like this is the part, and I want to get into this next section where we talk about kind of like, we've discussed who's being discussed. Now I want to talk about some of the left-wing cope that we're experiencing here.
So the first one is obviously, I'm sure that they're probably telling themselves, have we considered calling the voters racist enough?
Yeah, have we done that hard enough? I mean, I don't think that's probably the real problem here, is that we haven't actually called them, Nazis hard enough. Or maybe they didn't hear. If you looked at what they were doing in Belgium with respect to their fact-checking ahead of the European Parliament, the fact-checking apparatus that they have was being used exclusively against right-wing parties. And I remember, and again, if you don't think this happens in the United States, I know most people do, but if you don't think this happens in the United States, I remember sitting in a committee back in, I think it was either 2016 or 2017. And I watched what you would have called a fairly moderate Democrat bring forth a bill that was going to set up a commission to help school children in public schools differentiate between, propaganda or misinformation or fake news and the real genuine article. And if you looked at the various people on that commission that he wanted to help set the standards for what that would look like, they were all left-wing. Now, again, the National Education Association doesn't call itself, we're nonpartisan. 99% of our campaign donations go to far left liberals and Democrats, but we're nonpartisan, right? Yeah, just like the NRA, nonpartisan. But that's who they wanted setting up rules. Well, once again, when you ask why are people on the right so skeptical of a lot of these fact-checking organizations, is because they always end up being mobilized. Like they will give the appearance like, oh, we fact-checked Hillary Clinton. We found her statement to be mostly false. See, we're neutral. And then until you get into an election cycle and you look at the overwhelming majority of who they're fact-checking and the way they're fact-checking. I know because I was fact-checked. And I remember being told that something I said was mostly false. And if you read the article, you realize that, well, actually what I said was absolutely true. I made this claim about someone's voting record. And they came in the article like, what he said about the voting record is technically right, but what he meant was this. No, I didn't. But they felt perfectly, no, that was journalistic integrity right there. We're going to go ahead and ascertain what we think you meant by the claim and then say that your claim was false, not based off of our analysis of what you said, but based off of our analysis of what you thought.
Yeah. It was literally a straw man, built up in one article.
Yeah. So let's look at, I love this.
The big one is immigration.
Well, no. We're not there yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah, go
With
back
the
to
Cope?
go back to the Washington Post.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, on the leftist Cope side. I want to look
All
at this
right.
Washington Post article because, first of all, this map, if you can't see it, I mean, it shows you where. I mean, it shows you which portions of the country were voting right, left, or regional.
Have you seen the maps of Germany? Where
No.
it's like when you look at the electoral map here. Let me give you an example of this. When you look at the results within individual countries, right? So
Yeah.
the entire EU had an election, but obviously there were elections within each individual country. Here's the map of Germany from their election results. What does that look like?
Yeah, East Germany was very
Incredibly based. They all voted for AFD. By the way, I want to bring this up. AFD are everybody. If you look at any mainstream source, they would say AFD are Nazis, AFD are Nazis, AFD are fascists.
Yeah.
When you look at the AFD's platform, AFD supports free markets.
Yeah.
You know why they're listed as Nazis and fascists? Because they say we want controlled immigration.
Yeah.
And we want to preserve German culture and history and language and customs and all of that.
How amazing is that? That once again, if you say like I want to respect our culture and heritage. If the left was talking about any other country in the world, any third world country,
they'd be fine with it.
any country that is allied with them ideologically, they would say, of course you need to respect your. In fact, in the United States, they think we have an obligation to support and protect somebody's cultural heritage.
They'll support it all the way up to the whole honor killings thing and go mum on that.
But we don't get one. We don't get one. And it's because why? Because we're bad. We're evil. We're mean.
This gets back into the whole World War II destroyed Europe. And it's especially bad in Germany. You are not allowed to be a patriot, let alone a nationalist in Germany. Because if you have any pride for your own country, if you have any connection to the culture and history of it, you must be a bad guy. And this is why the left has been able to get away in Europe. This is why the left has been able to get away with what they got away with. Because ultimately, in Europe, the communists won World War II, at least in the East, right?
Yeah.
And so and here's the thing, when the Soviet Union fell and the Eastern Bloc fell, that actually strengthened the communist movement because they never had to answer for the crimes against humanity that the Soviet Union was engaged in because there was no Soviet Union anymore.
Yeah.
This gets back to an older podcast that we did where you read off from like newspaper quotes from 30 years ago, where there were college professors that were Marxists, that were socialists, that said things like, I think it's a great thing what's happening right now in Eastern Europe because it means that we're not going to have to answer for what the Soviet Union does anymore. We can just have this intellectual flourishing of, now we can talk about Marxism and gender or Marxism and race. This is where you get cultural Marxism replacing the old economic Marxism as the mainstream ideology of the left. That happens after the end of the Cold War. Nick, you told me something a couple years ago. And you were like, I remember like when the Soviet Union fell and the Eastern Bloc fell. And I kept thinking like, we've won the argument.
Yeah.
It's over. There's no more debate to be had.
Yeah.
And now fast forward 30 years and you're like, what world are we living in now?
Oh, yeah.
Where the only people that are allowed to vote for the AFD are the ones that lived under communism, right?
Yeah.
You can look at the map right here. It's the clear divide between East and West Germany. And if you vote for a party that is pro-free market, last I checked, the Nazis were not pro-free market, right? Avowed pro-free market, and their only criticism is, we don't want mass immigration. We don't want replacement level immigration, and we want to defend our national culture and tradition and heritage. You must be mid-century Germans. Again, it's almost like people's philosophies are broken because a lot of these traditions, like nationalism, a lot of these traditions that come out of the continent, like right-wing anti-liberalism, these things don't have any history before 1933, which is absurd because when you read philosophy, you can actually trace these things all the way back to like the Greeks or the early church fathers even. These concepts actually go back thousands of years, but because of the events of the 20th century and which side engaged in, well, they both engaged in atrocities because the Nazis and the Soviets were both murderous dictatorial regimes. Yeah. But because one of those regimes was victorious in half of Europe and then ruled the continent for 40 years, and then collapsed, and there was never any sort of reconciliation for what they did, and the fact that you can take the oppressed dynamic and you can be like, oh, it doesn't work with the working class anymore, so we're just going to retool it now. We're going to turn it into a cultural form of Marxism rather than an economic one. They're able to just get away with it without any sort of opposition, and if any opposition does come up, again, you must be mid-century Germans. Yeah. No, how about I'm just a rational human being that doesn't want to be ruled by a bunch of Marxists?
Yeah. No, it's you look at some of the articles. I got this one from the Washington Post up, and it's this whole idea of map the geography of Europe's far right success by Adam Taylor, because again they have to always come up with some sort of explanation that doesn't ever include listening to the opposition. Never. Like if I didn't want to listen to the left, that's impossible. It's impossible because I'm inundated with leftist ideology pretty much everywhere I go with, stuff you want. It's almost impossible to escape it. But it is amazing to me how the left can absolutely just ignore any sort of criticism, any sort of critique. It's reached obtuse levels. So he goes, what explains it? Perhaps there's one interesting factor that may have been underobserved. Simple geography. Oh, that's it. Yeah, simple geography. In the maps above, produced by Jose de Vogue, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, and first published in the Dutch newspaper, the Volkskrant, Europe's recent voting has been mapped. On the left-hand side, you see how the votes across the political spectrum were spread out. Next to it, a map shows how right-wing populism fits in. While the maps are broad approximations, they do show how that Europe's voting habits seem remarkably consistent. For example, European cities tend to be left-wing. It's easy to spot London, Paris, or Berlin, little islands of red on the left-hand map. Not everywhere followed this rule, however. In Norway and Sweden, it's clearly reversed. Right-wing populism often finds itself most at home just outside of these leftist metropolitan areas, according to Vogdel's map. More surprising still, however, is how some voting habits seem to tie into geographical surroundings. The Economist picked up on this, noting that the flat plains of southern Sweden, East Anglia, northeastern France, Flanders, and Pandania vote for right-wing populists, while the hilly regions like Cumbria, southwest France, and most of the Alps tend to stick with the mainstream parties. Notice how it's far right versus mainstream parties. There is no far left, there is no extreme left, there is no nothing. There's far right and mainstream parties. That's it. This is the part where I looked at this, I'm like, oh, this is cope. The maps also show clear historical lines. Historical manufacturing regions such as the northwest of England tend to red, and keep in mind, red for this is the left. We're the only country in the world where red is conservative. Everywhere else it's blue. As does Catalonia. The south of Holland, once known as the Generality lands and economically deprived, is now a prime place for right-wing populism, as is Flanders, the Flemish-speaking north of Belgium, and Alsace, once a part of Nazi Germany, has long shown supports for France's National Front.
Unbelievable. You know what's incredible is it was part of Nazi Germany for 4 years. It was part of the German Empire for 40 years. And before that, it was part of France, obviously. The fact that they just,
they're making that connection.
I'm waiting for them to you know what I'm waiting for them to do? I'm waiting for them to talk about the surge of the far right in Poland and be like, Danzig, once part of Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
It's now Gdansk, of course.
Yeah,
But I cannot believe, actually, I can't believe that they would put that. Alsace, once part of Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
For 4 years after they conquered France in the Battle of France in June 1940. And then at best, you could say part of the German Empire, maybe, because that was a whole generation, two generations even. But the gall of them to say something like that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, it gets worse. Let's look at Statista. Statista, which again, I think Statista really tries to publish, we're just data. We just show data and the data says what it says. Well, until you do your own commentary. And Martin Armstrong, he's a data journalist. Yeah, okay, let's go and look at that. Where Europe's far right has gained ground. On Wednesday, the far-right populist PVV Freedom Party, led by Geert Wilders, came out on top in the Dutch parliamentary elections. The Islamophobic party, which has promised to ban mosques and is calling for a freeze on asylum and a more restrictive immigration policy, is expected. You see how they did that right off the back? The Islamophobic.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing else to describe this party except Islamophobic. That's the only explanation for it. The map provides an overview of the strength of a selection of parties on the far right of Europe's political spectrum. These political parties have their differences, of course, but can be compared ideologically for, among other things, their strong nationalism and social conservatism. In the EU, several countries have become particularly effective breeding grounds. This is another thing. It's not constituencies. It's not areas that have they're breeding grounds, right? Where does any one of these journalists describe, the sociology department at Berkeley is a breeding ground for left-wing activists? Never. No, we're the ones that have breeding grounds. All right. The EU and several countries have particularly become effective breeding grounds for right-wing extremism. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party came to power in 2015. In the 2019 parliamentary elections, the PIS-led United Right coalition managed to retain a majority of seats in the Polish Sejm. However, the coalition lost its majority in October of 2023 parliamentary elections. Nevertheless, it remains in front, and the PIS currently holds 35% of seats, 42% when including its coalition partners. In Hungary, Viktor Orban's Fidesz has already been in power for over 10 years and won a landslide victory in 2022 parliamentary elections. It currently holds 59% of the parliamentary seats and forms a governing coalition with the Christian Democratic NKDP. In Austria, the FPO came to power in 2017, but after a sharp decline in the 2019 elections, the party now accounts for just 16%, down from 28% in 2017. A share similar to the achieved by the Resemblant National after its historic 22 legislative result in France. In Belgium, in the Flemish Nationalist Party, Vlaams Belang, currently blah, 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 blah. But again, you look at the terminology that's used, right? And the reason why I call this left-wing cope, it is not because there aren't certain political parties in Europe that actually probably would meet the classification of something you should be concerned about, right? Yes. But
I just wanted to point out that FPO actually came back in a big time in Austria this year. They're the far right party in Austria.
Yeah. But it's always the same thing, right? It's you're racist, you're sexist, because when they talk about strong, socially conservative, you're anti-LGBTQ, Islamophobic, xenophobic, fascist, right? This is the only way they know how to describe anybody to the right of Barack Obama. It's the only way they know how to describe. And there was an interesting article here. I want to bring it from the Daily Wire, because I thought they did a good job about talking about media orgs panicking after right-wing parties surge in European elections. So let's read through this. Because media organizations smeared right-wing parties in Europe over the weekend after they gained serious traction in elections across the continent as backlash grows to the political left's radical climate change agenda, inflation, and the millions of migrants that have come from the Middle East and Africa. News organizations from the New York Times to Reuters to the Associated Press labeled right-wing parties as far right, extreme right, radical right. Meanwhile, left-wing socialist parties were simply labeled as center-left and pro-democracy parties. And then they show the receipts on that. French President Emmanuel Macron was crushed by Marine Le Pen's national rally, which is set to become the country's largest political party. This is Macron speaking. The rise of nationalists and demagogues is a danger for our nation and for Europe. After this day, I cannot go on as though nothing has happened. And again, that he called for snap elections for France's parliament. But as he says, the rise of nationalists and demagogues, right? He is creating imagery in your mind. My party lost, and the reason why is because of nationalists and demagogues. Failed Austrian painter, right? Yes. In Germany, the country's center-right was leading, but the second strongest showing came from the country's Alternative for Germany, which media organizations claimed was an extreme right party. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, I always screw up these names, right-wing's Brothers of Italy party also made significant gains in Italy. Europe's Green parties and globalist left-wing parties suffered the largest losses in European Union parliamentary elections. Politico noted that if hard-right parties formed a single group, they would be the second most powerful force in EU's parliament behind the center-right European People's Party. And he goes, examples of some of the scary-sounding lines the media used to describe the elections included. Reuters, it reflects a growing trend in the West to turn from the mainstream and status quo towards radical alternatives such as former and possibly future U.S. President Donald Trump. New York Times, the outcome has unsettled the bloc's mainstream establishment and seems likely to steal the far right as a disruptive force. The Washington Post, for years we've talked about a seemingly inexorable trend. Little by little, Europe's far right was gaining ground and nudging its way closer to power. Political firewalls against extremist factions once considered beyond the pale tumbled from country to country. Axios, the center held in some countries, but a surge by the radical right, especially in Germany, has put pro-democracy parties on notice. The Associated Press, far-right parties rattled the traditional powers in the European Union and made major gains in parliamentary elections Sunday, dealing an especially humiliating defeat to French President Emmanuel Macron. Many of these trends, so this is Daily Wire, many of these trends reflect political wins in the U.S. where voters overwhelmingly disapprove of the job that President Joe Biden is doing, especially after millions of illegals have stormed into the U.S. Energy prices have skyrocketed and inflation has wreaked havoc on families. So the reason why I call it left-wing cope is because they simply, it is the arrogance of any suggestion that maybe there's legitimate critiques of the way they have governed. And not just the way they have governed, but legitimate critiques of their governing philosophy. You guys are rooted in Marxism. You want more central planning. You want more centralized control of the economy. You seem to think that you can have both a massive welfare state subsidized by the taxpayers within your country and then have mass immigration with no consequences, right? And people for years have kind of put up with it. And now all of a sudden they get to the point where it's like, this is ridiculous. And once upon a time, I was so scared of being called a xenophobe or a racist or a sexist or a transphobe or a homophobe or whatever else, that I was like, I'm just going to, okay, maybe, sure, we can do it. We're a wealthy country. We're a welcoming country. We can do all this. And then all of a sudden you see some of the most absurd things taking place. You see some of the worst crime taking place. You see just a complete flagrant disregard for anything that would be considered common sense immigration policy. And one day people start to wake up and be like, you know what? I'm not the crazy one. I'm not any of the things you're calling me. You're screwing up. You're turning my beloved country, my neighborhood, my community into something I don't recognize. And you don't get to sit here and tell me to sit down and shut up or else you'll call me names. Not anymore. And what was the left's response? We're just going to call you Nazis even harder.
Oh, yeah.
They literally cannot make any other argument than that. And you know what's incredible is that you're going to eventually get to a point where that argument doesn't work anymore. My best advice, and we actually have plenty of Europeans that listen to this podcast. I know for a fact that we have some Europeans that listen to us in the UK. We have some in the Netherlands. We have some in Sweden even. And my best advice to you is don't let anybody cow you into submission by hurling labels and names at you in an attempt to smear you.
Yeah.
You have every right to say, as a resident of this country, as a citizen of this country, as somebody who comes from this country, I have a right to defend principles and values and traditions and culture and history and language of my country. And I don't really care what the clowns are hurling at me. You do not need to be scared when the lunatics say you're a fascist, because you know that you're not one. You're a normal person. You read off a lot of the principles and manifestos and ideologies of some of these parties that were labeled as far-right extremist parties, and many of them are the type of principles that 99% of the people around the entire world believed until, quite frankly, just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And certainly until just like a century or two ago. And you can hold all of those positions and not be afraid of again, what absolute lunatics are going to say about you. And I think that that's what's happened in Europe. Did the European continent decide to wake up one day and put on the Hugo Boss uniform and go invade Poland? No. The European continent woke up one day and said, we're run by a bunch of lunatics and we're done dealing with this. And unfortunately, it wasn't the entire continent. It was a good chunk of it, but it obviously wasn't the entire continent.
Yeah.
And if you're on the right, you don't. This is something that Europe especially has to grapple with on a scale that the United States does not. We don't have this problem in the United States because we're separated by a lot of history and a lot of geography. But in Europe, they do, unfortunately. And in Europe, the right has to grapple with the specter of mid-century Germans, and they have to grapple with understanding that you do not need to be fearful of the idea that the clowns are equating you with these people.
Yeah.
You know you're not these people. You know that the principles and traditions and values that you stand for are again, what every normal, decent person believed until just a few years ago. And you don't need to be afraid to believe in those things.
Well, and again, I go back to the way you know they're full of crap is that if they really believed in this idea that there's no such thing, that it's inappropriate or wrong for anybody in a European country or the West in general to want to protect their own traditions or cultural heritage, right? If that's all just dog whistling racism, well, then why are they running around saying Palestine for the Palestinians? Why would they bristle at any notion of us telling a nation in South America or Africa or Asia that they're not allowed to have a country and a nation? The whole reason why we had like the Peace of Westphalia was this idea that we wanted to set up nation states where people could self-determine within those nation states what sort of rules they wanted to live by within civil society without fear of being invaded because they had the wrong religion, right? And so it was this idea that, no, this is how we're going to maintain peace. And what the left has essentially done is said, no, we don't want the nation state. Marxism must dominate. We're not going to call it that, right? But the oppressors must rise up and overthrow, the oppressed must rise up and overthrow their oppressors, which is basically the same thing. And that's the ideology that needs to dominate. And these borders stand in our way. You know, workers of the world unite, right? Oppressed of the world unite under your banner, of course. In support of your political objectives, of course.
The borders are racist crowd will also say things like, again, from the river to the sea.
Yes.
Which again tells you everything you need to know about how full of it they are.
They're full of crap.
They selectively apply nationalism, identitarianism, borders.
Where nationalism advances leftism, they will be nationalists.
It goes back to my point about how Sinn Féin were nationalist, extreme left-wing Marxists, and they proudly identified as nationalists when they were setting off car bombs in Northern Ireland in order to suit their political ends. But now that nationalism doesn't get the job done, we're going to be globalists. We're going to be multiculturalists. And we're going to denigrate anybody that wants to support Irish nationalism as being far-right extremists and racist bigots.
Well, again, here's my question. If a European country, if the United States went into a South American country right now, an African country right now, an Asian country right now, came in and essentially demanded that our cultural norms, traditions, beliefs, and values, religious faiths, demanded that they be accommodated and given equal status, if not superior status in some cases, to the local traditions. You know what the left would call it? Colonialism. But yet, when it happens as a result of immigration policy, they don't call it that.
This gets back to my point that I've tried to make a lot in our circle group and in other places too, is that part of the problem is that liberalism has strengths for sure. There's a balance between individual freedom and security, and I always want to lean more on the freedom side because I see what happens when, if you read enough history, you know what happens when strongmen get into place. Europe is a good example of this, actually, right? But liberalism also philosophically has some terrible critical flaws that make it incapable of defending itself sometimes. And a good example of this is the multicultural aspect, right? It's when you make tolerance the foundational principle of your ideology. This gets back to one of your criticisms, Nick. Tolerance of what?
Yeah.
This is actually Geert Wilders' point in the Netherlands when he says that Islam, as it's being imported into Europe, is incompatible with European values and traditions and with democracy for that matter. How many democracies, how many flourishing democracies are there in the Middle East? Is Saudi Arabia a democracy? Is Iran a democracy? Do they have any sort of
they'll claim they'll have elections, but it goes to the same. There was a protest going on in Canada, right? And there was a man there who was Muslim, and they interviewed him. He goes, "Well, no, we're Muslims. Of course we want Sharia law. Of course we want this." And this is the part where when somebody gets up and says, "Oh, okay, well, if you want Sharia law, if you want Islam to essentially be the not just a dominant faith, but the legal order within a society." That is incompatible with our current system as it exists. If you say that, you get accused of being Islamophobic. Okay, now if I went into Iraq, I've been there, right? If I went into some of these other countries and I said, okay, and funny, you can actually claim in Iraq, that's exactly what we did. We said, nope, you're going to have parliamentary democracy, and we're going to say that you have to live this way, right? This is the new order for it. But what's funny is that one of the biggest critiques of that came from the left. right, came from the left.
Yeah.
And so this is, again, where you go into some of these places and you say, wait a second, it is not, I'm not being illogical. I'm not being racist. I'm not being sexist, right? Because again, it would be racist to assume that all Arabs believe a certain way about Islam. It would be racist to assume
It would also
that.
just be incorrect.
Yeah, it would be, and it would be incorrect, right? But it's this idea that if you're going to suggest that somebody who believes that Islam should, like an imam, which comes right out and says, yes, Islam will overtake Europe and Sharia law will dictate this. If you say, okay, that's not compatible with the way that we currently run things, that is an accurate statement. Now, if you then go and say, and therefore I dislike all Muslims, or therefore I dislike all Arabs, okay, now that's incorrect because not all Muslims think that way. Not all Arabs think that way. But if you're saying, look, we have a major transference of people that actually hold to this belief, and it is now impacting the way our country operates. I'm sorry, you're not a horrible, no good, evil, Islamophobic person to point that out. And again, I have friends that are Muslims that I fought alongside in Iraq. We have guys that we got back to the United States. They love this country and they want to preserve the constitutional order of this country while also being Muslim. I don't got any problem with that guy, right? This is my countryman right here.
But that's not the type of people that Europe is importing in mass right now.
Well, it's certainly not the type. It's certainly unfair to suggest that none of those people are coming in through immigration.
Sure,
It's certain. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's unfair. It's unfair to suggest that anybody that points out, well, hey, there is a distinction between, again, my Muslim buddy who I fought alongside for the United States, who wants to live in peace in the United States and really respects our constitutional order, and somebody that comes in who says, you know, the United States is the great white or the great Satan, and it needs to be overthrown.
Death to America.
Yet says that at a mosque in the United States. Am I not allowed to distinguish between those two things?
Well, I mean, you've seen the videos of people in the U.S. now saying things like "Death to America." Like it used to be that you would see these videos in Yemen of them saying it. Now they're in the U.S. And again, this gets back to some of my criticisms of the modern interpretation of liberalism, because the problem that we're running into right now is that you have an ideology that is predicated on tolerance, but again, tolerance of what? Yeah. Well, they're certainly not tolerant of the people that they label as far right.
Yeah.
Right. But we're going to be tolerant of these other ideologies. And it's not just Islam too. Marxism is another good example of this. We're going to be tolerant of these other ideologies that if they get their way, all of these traditions and cultures will be bulldozed. And replaced with either the new Soviet man or replaced with another foreign culture and tradition. And at some point, and you know what's interesting is in Europe, it's the younger generation that's catching on to this more than the older generation because they're further removed from the mid-20th century. And they're further removed from Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And so what you see in countries like Poland and Germany, France increasingly, is younger voters tend to be more on the right than the older voters. This is especially true in Poland and Germany right now.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the reason that this is happening is because younger voters have been told if they're in their 20s or even in their late teens and even in their early 30s, if they're in that frame of like, you know, younger than 35 but older than 18, what they've been told their whole life is that liberalism promised, and when I say liberalism, I mean, you know, like the type of parties that identify as this within the European Parliament. Liberalism promised this future where everybody's going to be singing Kumbaya and we're going to have maximum freedom and there'll be, you know, just abundance flowing forth and it'll be this utopia. Liberalism promised utopia. And instead what it delivered is huge problems when it comes to assimilation and immigration, huge problems when it comes to inflation and mismanagement of the economy, huge problems when it comes to energy policy. And it didn't actually deliver on any of these things. And so I think a lot of younger people in these European countries are going back and they're reading some of these older traditions. They might be exposed to some older philosophies. And I'm talking about like way before the 20th century. And they're coming to the conclusion that everything that I was told about how the right or the bad guys is actually wrong.
Is this going to impact U.S. elections? I think it is. I think it is because what you're seeing happening in Europe right now, it's in some ways is manifesting itself a little bit differently, but there's similar problems because the fundamental questions are very similar, right? If you look at what the left has largely won the ideological argument. They haven't always been in power and gotten to do everything they wanted, but they've largely won the ideological argument over the last several decades, in part because they've been so influential in Hollywood and in education. And that has translated to influence in politics as well, to where even parties that you would have considered to be more right-wing, the current Conservative Party in the UK is about to get obliterated, despite everything that's going on. And it's not because people love left-wing ideology in the UK. It's because they're so furious with the Conservative Party for essentially not providing any sort of contrast. And so the end result is like, well, screw you if you're not going to get the job done. So here's what I would say. For anyone on the left that is watching this, if you really want to know what people are mad about, here's an idea. Stop listening to the media, because apparently there's such a degree of ideological capture there that they have no concern about addressing what are relevant concerns. And those relevant concerns have been articulated to anybody that's bothered to listen. And here's the difference. The left, especially academia, politicians, and the media, they don't want to listen. But guess what? There's a whole lot of people that do. So if you really want to know, if anybody in left-wing journalism really wants to know why they just got crushed in this last election cycle, immigration has become an issue. And I know you would love to believe that it's all because if you're right wing, you're just xenophobic and racist. We get it. That's what you're going to call us. If you want to actually listen for a moment on what it is, here's what you'll find out. You will find out that most people on the right do not have a fundamental problem with immigration, but we do love our countries. We do love our traditions, and we do understand that culture matters. And in the United States, we actually have a pretty good history of people coming from various cultures all over the world and it being integrated into our system, provided that there's a fundamental commitment to certain principles, those principles that we associate with America. And lo and behold, Poland has certain principles. Germany, France, the UK, they all have certain fundamental principles that they associate with what it means to be Polish or German or British or French or an American. In America, I would say that those ideological positions are generally rooted in things like individual liberty, personal responsibility, property rights, free markets, the ability to live your life the way you want, to engage in commerce with the people that you want to engage in commerce with, to associate with, that you choose to associate with, and to otherwise leave people alone if you can't agree. These have been fundamental precepts of what it's meant to be an American. And if you're going to try to come into this country and fundamentally alter those, yes, there's going to be a problem. Now, if you would like to come into our country and share your culture while respecting those underlying principles, what you find is that the United States is one of the most welcoming places on the globe. You will also find that, I would gather, within a lot of European countries as well. But what the left has offered us on immigration is you either let everybody in the way we want, or you're a racist. Well, guess what? You've taken the sting out of that word, which is unfortunate, because there is such a thing as a legitimate racist. There is such a thing as legitimate racism, which needs to be opposed. There is an actual definition of racism. And as a concept, it must be seen as illegitimate. But unfortunately, when you categorize anybody that has any sort of opposition to the way you're running a policy as racist, you're going to get two types of people: the people that reject that definition and oppose you. And then you're going to get other people that say, well, fine then. Fine then. If this is racism, then fine, they're a racist. You don't want that. Another thing has to do with energy policy. This is another thing that is huge in Europe right now. If you want to know why you're getting your clock clean, it's because of energy policy. You have such a commitment to this idea of getting rid of anything associated with fossil fuels, and in some cases, nuclear energy, which is the cleanest, most efficient kind. And what it suggests to them is that you don't care about the plight of people that are struggling to try to heat their homes or run their businesses, as long as you get your ideological agenda associated with, quote, saving the planet. And they've seen firsthand how it has led to a massive amount of cronyism, where some of the same politicians that seem to be so concerned about saving the planet don't mind jet setting all around the world for their elaborate, expensive conferences, and then ensure that all the money that goes to these green energy subsidies seem to go to companies which also donate to their campaigns or for which they have some other financial interest. When you put the interest of an ideological approach to energy, not a scientific one, an ideological approach to energy, it has real world effects on people, and it impacts the poorest people the hardest. And they're rejecting you for it. You can listen, or you can just call them all climate deniers. And I think we know what you're going to do because you're already doing it. It's the same thing with the economy in general. People want to be able to run their businesses. They want to be able to work. They don't want to be constantly told what they can do, what they can't do. They don't want to pay taxes, which fund a massive welfare state that they don't see themselves as getting the benefits from because you're too busy giving it to other people who just showed up in the country yesterday. That ties in not only with the economic policy, but also with your immigration policy. It's not that people on the right are not generous or don't wish to help people. In fact, you will find that overwhelmingly, Christian conservatives, regardless of where you're at in the world, donate the highest percentage of their income to charity voluntarily. That's not because we don't care about the downtrodden. It's not because we don't care about the people that are hurting. But when you attempt to take that charitable component, that altruistic component, and then impose it by force and turn it into a policy which breeds not gratitude for the people that made it possible, but rather a sense of entitlement and envy, it becomes corrosive and destructive within society. Finally, the other part I want to hit on here, and this is something that we're seeing in the United States, it's crime. It's crime and terrorism. When you actually have a policy which is leading to areas in France that they call no-go zones, and I know the left-wing media has done their level best to try to pretend that this doesn't actually exist. But this is once again a problem that the left has. You have done such a good job of ideological capture within the university and within think tanks that you honestly believe that you can replace reality and personal experience with carefully curated statistics. Oh, this isn't going on if you look at the data this way. I guarantee you it's going on to the little girl that gets raped in a portion of Paris because she's a Jew. I guarantee you, to the people that are having difficulty, that are living in some of these areas or adjacent to some of these areas, who feel afraid to go in them, not because some right-wing activist has convinced them it's bad, not because they're racist or xenophobic, but because there's been very, very real consequences associated with it. I guarantee you, you showing them a study you conducted is not going to make up for the real fear they feel. And because you've refused to listen to them, because it might cause you to have to look back at your own ideology and your own policies and wonder if maybe you've done something wrong. See, the problem is that you've taken every single one of your policies and you've tied them so closely to a political ideology, and that you have demonized anybody that's opposed it, that the moment you actually have to go back, reevaluate and say, gosh, maybe we should have done this differently, all of a sudden, in your mind, you've given credence to the racists, to the xenophobes, to the fascists, and you've denigrated your own core philosophy. So introspection is no longer possible, is it? Nope, just demonization. This train is going in one direction. It isn't stopping. And if you don't get out of the way, you get run over. And the way you look at it as, well, I guess they deserved it. Well, the problem now is a lot of people have woken up to that. So, by all means, keep calling us the names, keep writing your articles, keep denigrating us in the press and in the movies and in Hollywood and with your fact checkers, because what you're going to learn, which you've already started to learn in the EU parliamentary elections, and what you're going to learn in further elections, is we don't care anymore. We don't care anymore. Now, I will say this, because here's the one thing I do care about. Because the last thing I want is for elements that are trying to oppose what you're doing, who do actually hold bad values, who do actually have racist tendencies or ideology or sexist tendencies and ideology. I don't want them to become dominant in the opposition to what you're doing. I want the opposition to what you're doing to be clearly associated with concepts that every human being has inherent worth by virtue of being created in the image of God. I want the opposition to be clearly associated with the idea of free markets, genuinely free markets, not cronyism. I want it to be associated with a deep and abiding love for concepts of things like free speech and freedom of conscience, freedom of association. I want it to be associated with free markets, with property rights, with the ability to actually build something, own it, and to be able to use it for the advantage of you, your family, and your community. I want it to be associated with self-determination, and I want it to be associated with personal responsibility, where we don't buy into the idea that we can get away with whatever we want as long as the party or the group or the organization justifies it. Because I do believe in objective truth, and I do believe in objective morality, and I want those to always be the bedrocks of what we believe and what we fight for. So that's our obligation on the right. We can see how we're caricatured when we win. We can see also how we're treated when we lose. So we better not lose. But we also better make sure that when we win, and I think we will, that we do so on a firm foundation that is rooted in objective truth and morality. Because if we can't do that, we don't deserve to win, and we will create something almost as bad. Once again, thank you for joining us on Making the Argument. We hope you found this informative. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun for us. We love talking about these philosophical conversations. It's always interesting to see.
Well, at least one of us does.
What's going on in other areas and how it might play out for the United States as well. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next episode.